Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I love to bring to you, as you know, if you are a regular listener, people who are committed to their own growth and also the growth and development of others in their organization. And today I have a very special guest. Her name is Angela Priest. Angela, welcome to my show.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, Angela has been involved in her own personal development, and she now helps organizations. We'll go into the details in just a moment. I want to give a shout out to our good friend and colleague, super connector, Sejal Thacker, who introduced us. Sejal is just an amazing human being who's been a guest on my show, and she has introduced me to other past guests where I've had some great conversations. So many, many thanks to Sejal. So Angela, before we dive in, let me tell people a little bit about you. Angela is a seasoned executive and operational strategist with a 20-year track record of improving business operations and leading transformative change in a variety of industries. She's the former head of performance improvement at J.D. Power, and there she structured the customer delivery operating model, improving quality, performance, and time to value as part of a strategy that led to a $1.1 billion exit. And today, Angela is now the founder of Grow You LLC. She provides advisory services to businesses to help them navigate the intersection between employee needs and operational performance. As she guides clients to scale their businesses, she also helps them bolster employee engagement, customer retention, and profitability. I know you stay very busy with those kinds of projects, Angela, and I want you to start out by telling us a little bit about your journey from the corporate world to the work you do today with clients.
Yeah. So if you'd asked me 10 years ago if I would be off consulting on my own, I would probably have said, you're crazy. That's that's not part of my journey. But one of the things that is a common thread through all of the positions that I've held is that I'm really drawn to areas of businesses where there's a lot of chaos. So I'm just a problem solver by nature, always loved strategy games as a kid, loved solving puzzles. And for me, chaos in a business is just kind of an opportunity to solve another puzzle. So it's an area where I really, really thrive and enjoy. But what that really enabled me to do was really understand the inner workings of various businesses. So I've been at startups, I've been at growth companies, I've been at corporate environments like JD Power. But what I started to realize is that the problems really are universal across all of those different business environments. The symptoms and how you solve them might vary a little bit, but there's some common themes that happen. And I noticed that when those things started to crop up, what would often happen is that these companies would bring in big, expensive consultancies to help them solve the problem. And those consultancies would come in with a textbook methodology, and they would come in with a lot of templates and frameworks and all of these things. And they would kind of dump them on the business. And then they would leave, and folks like myself would be left with kind of trying to figure out how to make these things work and salvage some of the value. And what I came to realize is that approach to kind of solving problems in businesses doesn't really work all that well. And that frameworks are really a mechanism to help you do the thinking through a problem. So the frameworks aren't the be all end all. A lot of frameworks are developed in unique contexts. unique kind of levels of maturity for companies to meet a particular need. And so cookie cutter approaches just don't really work all that well. And so they tend to cause a lot of pain for the people just trying to get their jobs done within an organization. And on top of that, oftentimes change management is kind of this asterisk that's a footnote at the bottom of the page. It's like, okay, now you need to change manage. And what I saw happening was that change management would be treated like a one-way communication. Okay, we did our presentation at the town hall and ready, go. And then all of this stuff would just fall apart. And so what I came to understand and why I started my business was that companies need to have an understanding of these frameworks to help them think through the problems, but they don't need all the jargon. They don't need all of the textbook. What they need is kind of somebody to help them navigate through the frameworks and find what works for them, while also having a recognition that you really need communication isn't just about, or change management isn't just about communication. It's actually about how do you engage your employees in the change and how do you make them want to be a part of that. And so that's why I really founded Grow You, was to really focus in on those types of challenges. How do you make people excited about the change? How do you engage them in it? How do you empower them in it? Because that's really how you get these transformational high performance environments.
Well, the work you're doing is so important. And one of the things that's interesting that is a thread that was through your bio and also just my earlier conversation with you was this balance that you work to achieve, between the needs of the employees and then operational performance. What have you found to be the challenges of trying to balance those two, and how is your approach different to make sure that both of those get addressed?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I actually came to that balance through a lot of trial and error and falling on my face, as many folks do. You learn what doesn't work. And what I really learned is that being directive when you're trying to go through change efforts actually isn't the most effective way. It conveys rigidity. It conveys disempowerment. It conveys a lot of different things. So the reason why I achieve that, I focus on achieving that balance, is because when people are going through change, we all have a natural tendency to resist it. And that's normal. It's part of our psychology. You're not going to change that. Some people are better at adapting and moving through it than others. So there's a spectrum. But in general, as people, we like to maintain the status quo. The status quo is comfortable. It's easy. It's habitual. And when you're going through change in an organization, it can feel like things are out of control. And so we gravitate towards the things that we can control because it brings the anxiety down. It makes things feel easier, those types of things. As a leader in an organization, when you become directive, what you're actually doing, that's how you are navigating the change. And that's what I've come to realize about leaders. They become directive as their own way of dealing with their anxieties and things about kind of that change effort. So they take control. Well, as a leader, when you take control, guess what you're doing? You're removing control from your front lines. You're removing control from your employees in a change situation where they already are innately predisposed to feel disempowered. And so the way that I approach this is, how do we give everyone in this process a sense of control so that they can engage and so that it doesn't kind of trigger those anxiety mechanisms in our psychology. And so the idea is to say, okay, leaders, the part of this that you control is really the goals, the objectives, what you would like to see in terms of outcomes, what you would like to see in terms of your expectations. So let's paint the picture of what that looks like. And then we'll take that, and that becomes the rules of the game for your employees to go and design how to get there. And that doesn't mean that the executives and leaders aren't involved in that. It just means that you give them the parameters and then you allow them to co-create what the future looks like and what the future holds, rather than just saying you're going to do it this way because I said this is the way that you do it. And what I've found in that approach is that executives get what they want, but employees feel this sense of motivation and hopefulness and empowerment and momentum in being able to create something that they own that affects their day-to-day. And essentially what you do is you sidestep the resistance. So you go around it completely.
How about giving an example of, not with the name, but just a process you may have taken an organization through? What was a change or an example of a change? Where were they? What were they struggling with? What did you specifically do? And then what was the outcome as a result of your help?
Yeah, so I focus on rapid change. One of the things that I love doing is, when I hear a company has spent 8 or 9 months working through a particular problem, I love putting that down into a workshop form where I'm going to say, okay, we're going to take 3 days and we're going to rapidly get to a solution so that all of us can just go back to our day jobs. So this can stop being disruptive. I actually deal with a lot of companies, and this has to do with the size. I typically deal with companies that are under 200 people. I have dealt with larger companies, but typically I work with companies that are under 200 people. Companies in that particular growth range tend to have challenges in their customer onboarding processes and customer delivery processes. Those are just kind of some natural, that's a natural kind of growing pain that tends to occur around that stage. So what I'll typically do is I'll take them through first a quick exercise to just understand, how are you thinking about this problem? Like, how are you thinking about it? What do you know about it? This is a point where a lot of companies will try and bring out kind of metrics and measures and all of this. And I say, set all of that stuff aside. Just tell me what you know about this problem. What will I see if I come into your organization and watch it play out? And they'll kind of describe some things, and that'll kind of set the baseline for, okay, what is this problem that we're trying to solve? Let's get real clarity around the problem that we're trying to solve, why we're trying to solve it, why we're trying to solve it now, and what we hope to get out of a solution. So once we solve this, what will be different within your organizations? And those are typically a few questions that I ask to start. So I did this with a company recently where same thing, we're just kind of talking about their onboarding process. And a lot of times the challenge there is the time to value. So how long it's taking to get customers onboarding. Onboarded. And typically I'll see onboarding timeframes that are 2 to 3 times as long as they should be when they talk to me about that. So then what I'll do is I'll say, okay, we're going to go into this 3-day workshop, and we need a representative cross-section of people within your company who should be represented in this workshop. And I don't want the people who are just going to be excited about the change. I want the people who are maybe going to be a little bit skeptical, and I want the people who are maybe going to be a little bit quieter about the change. And I want the people who are going to advocate for it. But these people need to be influencers within your organization. Because if you can get the influencers on board, that then allows you to have peer-to-peer influence in the change as well, which is also tends to be much more powerful than a top-down approach. And then during the workshop, the 3-day workshop, I'll walk them through a set of sessions. The first kind of session is really about, how do we get clarity about what's in our process and what our process needs to do? Then I'll take them through an exercise of mapping out their processes. And so typically what I'll see during that process is you'll see people who don't understand the full process flow of how things get done. They understand their one little piece. And so they have their kind of narrow perspective of what happens. And so what you're really doing during that phase is creating empathy across all of these different roles, to say, oh, well, I didn't really understand that you did that. And that now I understand why when I ask you to do this other thing, you give me so many problems, right? So you create a unified view and a unified understanding of how the work gets done today. Then what I'll do is I'll take them through and I'll say, okay, here are some typical patterns of inefficiency in processes. So there's about 8 different patterns of inefficiency in processes. I'll walk them through and I'll say, tell me where those patterns exist in your process. And then we'll have a conversation about that. And so we'll get really, really hyper aligned around what the real challenges are and why those challenges exist. And then I'll say, okay, now that we know all of that stuff, let's scrap the whole thing. And this is the point where companies that I work with kind of get a little bit, they either get nervous or they kind of go, what do you mean? We just spent all of that time working through all of that and we're just going to scrap it. And I'll take them then through a guided ideation. So I'll ask certain questions. Okay, if we had limitless resources, what would we do to fix those problems? And they'll kind of, post some ideas up and we'll come up with a set of themes around those big ideas. And then I'll say, okay, now with the parameters that your executives gave you in mind, we're going to build a new process from scratch. What does that look like? And we build it out. And so you can kind of see through this process, what happens is it's not Angela's process that she came in and dumped on us. It is a process that's built with an understanding of what good process looks like, asking them the right questions so that they can become self-effective in finding a solution. And once you find that self-effective solution, what happens is a tremendous sense of ownership over that thing. There's a pride of authorship that now exists. And so when you go into plan, kind of, okay, now how do we have to get this in place? And what do we need to ask of our executives? What resources do we need? What decisions do we need them to make, et cetera, et cetera? It cleans up the whole process of kind of getting to solution. And what I hear often coming out of these workshops from the people that I work with are, wow, you made it so easy for us to get to transformative change. Or, wow, that first set of sessions was really, really hard and it was a slog and I was skeptical, but now getting to the end of it, I really understand why that was needed and why we were getting stuck. So it's kind of this learning exercise where each phase kind of builds a level of understanding that helps everybody on the problem solving team start from a common understanding to get to that next level of problem solving.
That makes so much sense. Now, you were talking about the parameters that the executives had laid out. Where does that happen? Is that in the 3-day workshop or is that something separate you do with them?
Yeah, that happens as preparation going into it. So I'll sit with executives and I'll say, okay, what would you like to see? You're doing this for a reason. You're trying to solve this problem for a reason. Why? Are you trying to get a faster time to value? Are you trying to open up bandwidth? Or potentially bring bandwidth into a reasonable frame? Maybe your employees are working, countless hours of overtime and you're at risk of them leaving the company. Or alternately, maybe, the ways that you're operating are creating some pain points for your customers and you're starting to lose customers because you just can't keep up with the work. And so my goal there is to really not just understand what executives want to see, but how would they know, like what are the observable factors and observable outcomes that would tell them that this problem no longer exists. And then during the workshop, making sure that all of the decisions the team is making are run through that lens. So sometimes I will have parameters on there like you can't affect any other workflows. So you need to just specifically work on this particular workflow. Okay. So then we're going to guide the team and say, your domain of authority, the things we can change are limited to this section of the business. So we can't change beyond that. Other times executives may say, you can change everything you want. And we also have a budget for X, Y, and Z things to help get that fixed. So, okay, team, we've got access. Here's the access that we have to various tools and things that we can do. So how do we integrate those? Sometimes an executive might have a perspective on what needs to be done. So sometimes an executive might say, I want to see this broken down into 7 steps. I want to be able to do our full process in 7 steps. Okay, so how do we as a team get this to 7 steps, or I want to see a 50% improvement, or I want to see a 20% margin. Or so what we're trying to do there is understand really what is the problem that the executives are struggling with, because it tends to look different at the executive level. So what is the problem that they're struggling with, and how can we help them get that through however we're designing the process? So that's how we create that alignment. It's, it creates kind of this mutually beneficial cycle, right? Where the team is helping the executive, therefore the executive wants to help the team.
So I'm curious, after you have finished this workshop and you've got this plan, how does that get communicated to the executives? Does a representative sample of the participants brief the executives, or what does that look like?
It can vary depending on the needs of the organization. And so how that generally works is I'll generally have an executive sponsor or a set of executives who I'm working directly with to kind of liaise between the team and a particular executive. Generally, I'll have one point of contact on the team. I'll have one executive that I'm working with. So I'm helping to do some of the translation there. During the workshop, and it differs from company to company. So I am very much of the mind that you have to operate in a way that feels natural to the company. So if they're a company who does checkpoints and does report outs with their executives, I'm going to schedule those in throughout the workshop so that we're updating the executive as we go through. I'm also touching base separately with the executive to let them know, here's my impressions, here's how I think the team is progressing, here's some things that I think that you need to know that are helpful to you as an executive, while also being transparent with the team about what I'm communicating up. So there's no surprises, there's no anxiety about, are you hurting us? Because I think a lot of times in these types of situations, people worry about what's being said behind closed doors. So we keep transparency. And then coming out of the workshop, we have a circle back where we meet with the executive or executive team, and we say, here's what we came up with. Here's our plan for how we think this needs to be implemented. And I have the team actually I have my kind of primary point person on the team actually walk them through what they learned, how they learned it, how they got to this conclusion, so that the executive can come along for the journey. So it's like, I think sometimes what happens with executives is they're concerned that the team is not going to think through everything that needs to be thought through. So what this workshop does, in the particular format it has, allows an executive to see, okay, wow, you really mapped out everything and you considered everything, and you considered multiple options for what it could look in the future, and here's why you made certain decisions. So they start to see a rational flow to the thinking that supports buy-in and adoption and commitment from the executive. So it kind of addresses both concerns. And what I found sometimes is the disconnect sometimes between executives and their teams is that the executives are seeing things from a much broader perspective. Necessarily so. They're running the business, whereas the folks on the ground, they're seeing it from their seat. So they have less of the information. And so sometimes when the executives are saying, "Hey, I see this thing. Why don't you see it? Go and fix this thing." The person's going, "I have no idea what you're talking about." So a lot of this workshop is about teaching the team to see and kind of enabling the executive to really trust what their team is coming out with.
So do you have executives that are present at the workshop for that aspect of communication, or are you conveying what you ascertained from your discussions with the executives?
Yeah, I generally do not have executives at the workshop. And I don't have executives at the workshop because people tend not to say what needs to be said when there's an executive in the room. They tend to, avoid saying the radical thing or the thing that everyone's thinking, but nobody's saying. Or if they are open with saying it, they tend to temper it. And so you don't get the same result. Now, there are some executives who really want to be involved in that. So for the executives who really want to be involved, what we'll do is myself and the point person, so the person essentially representing the team, will sit and do a debrief with the executive or executives after each day and say, here's what's going on. Here's what we know. Here's what we're thinking about. Here's where we go next, to keep them abreast of what those changes are. If there's additional need for reinforcement or additional questions the executive might have, I might meet with them separately, but that's generally how that would work. There's also, executives who are just like, hey, I actually don't care at all how this is solved. Just as long as you guys solve it, I don't care. And so in those situations, it's a lighter touch where I'm just going to meet with the we're going to meet with the executive before, and then we're going to follow up with the executive after. So we're not really gonna waste a lot of their time if they're just saying, I really, really don't care. And then there's kind of the middle of the road person who maybe needs some of that insight because there might be some concern, or they just really want to have some type of input. And so then we'll do scheduled feedback at certain parts during the workshop, or we'll say the team is going to share what they've done, and that's your opportunity to ask questions and give feedback. And in those situations, what I do ask is that the executives approach it from a supportive rather than critical standpoint. So if there's something that they want to critique, instead of offering the critique, ask a question that helps the team see what they're seeing.
That's a great point. And is this a 3-day workshop, 3 consecutive days, or do you have space in between?
The way that it works best is to have it be 3 consecutive days. And the reason why is because and this is why companies run into challenges, when they're trying to solve problems and they're finding that it's going on for month after month after month of conversation, is that as you're going through and you're learning, what you're doing is aligning. You're aligning with a common set of information. And so if you have a break or a pause in between those sessions, what's happening is you're creating a divergence where people are going and gathering and getting new information without the rest of the team having the same information. And so you have to constantly reset back to that kind of common foundation. So you can split it up. It's not ideal. I typically will really recommend very hard that a company do it all in a 3-day consecutive window, because it's just more effective. You are spending less time aligning and realigning that way.
And how many people would you generally have in a workshop?
Between 8 to 12 is the general.
Oh, okay.
So
and I'm asking specific questions because I'm imagining some of my listeners who may have other kinds of challenges in their businesses or in their organizations where they may not have thought of bringing together a group of people to follow a process like you're doing. And of course, you are the expert in this process that you've created. And I love the fact that it's so individualized. So you're not going in with this, like you said, existing framework. You've got a process yourself, but it sounds like there's a lot of flexibility in what you actually bring to the table for a given organization.
I think one of the things that's most important when you're dealing with operational changes or deciding how a business is going to operate is to work within the boundaries of their natural behaviors and ways of working, with certain exceptions. So for example, like the 3-day workshop, all consecutively. When somebody doesn't have to change their natural tendencies. So for example, if you have somebody who's very kind of rigid or structural in their ways of behaving and operating, you don't generally want to break that and try and have them function in an agile way. You'll spend more time just getting them to try and change that natural behavior than if you just say, okay, how do I make my approach more agile to meet them where they're at? Because if I can meet them where they're at, then it becomes much easier to navigate them through the change. And a lot of the feedback I get on my sessions speaks exactly to what you're talking about, Meredith, which is, wow, like one of the biggest benefits of doing this was to be able to get all of the right people in the room to talk about this until we got to a solution. And I think a lot of the fear that companies have in doing that is that they're going to take that, 1 day, 2 day, half day, however, whatever time block they're going to take, and they're not going to get the result out of it. And so part of what I do with my approach is provide the reassurance that here's the specific result we're going to get. The approach enables you to get that specific result. So you don't have to worry about whether or not that, 72 hours or 24 hours, however many hours across those multiple people is wasted. And so when I kind of am speaking with executives about it, I often talk to them about how much time are you losing by not having this solved? And so oftentimes I'll hear like, oh, and even if they don't have a concept of it, I'll say, look, if you have people wasting an hour a day because of this problem, that's 5 hours a week, 20 hours a month. You're starting to quickly get into the hundreds of hours. Multiply that by your number of people. You're getting into the thousands of hours. Now you're getting into full head counts worth of people. So what we're asking you to do is take 24 hours times 10 people, let's say 240 hours, to save you 10,000. Does that make sense now to take the 3 days? And sometimes they'll still be a little bit skeptical. I say, okay, well, what about, and they're often skeptical because they're afraid of what's going to happen. It's going to slow down our business. It's going to pause our business. But I think it's important for executives and business leaders to understand that if you can't pause your business for 3 days without it completely falling apart, that's a whole nother world of problem that you need to be thinking about. If you don't have the capability of pulling people out to solve a problem that's going to save you thousands of hours of lost labor, which also translates to an opportunity cost, that's thousands of hours wasted on something that could be invested in your business growth, then you're in a really, really risky position in your business. And you maybe want to spend time thinking about what you need to invest in order to get yourself out of that hole. So those are kind of some of the things that I encourage. You can probably tell, Meredith, I'm pretty direct in the way that I speak. I don't generally pull the punches because I think a lot of times people don't tell executives what they need to hear or business leaders what they need to hear. And I find that that's so critically important, that executives are human too. Like they have challenges, they have their own anxieties. They have ways that they are not able to see the picture in the way that they need to. And it can be even more difficult at the executive level because oftentimes you don't have as many people to talk to.
Yeah.
Or that you can talk to. And so it's important to have advisors or consultants or somebody who is not worried about necessarily losing their job by saying something that you might not like to hear. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I think about that.
Well, one of the other things I know that is really important to you is this whole idea of knowledge transfer.
Mm-hmm.
In scaling a business. Talk a little bit about that before we wrap up.
Oh, knowledge transfer. Now you're getting me going. So one of the things that often happens, particularly in white collar businesses, is you run into issues of knowledge transfer. Knowledge is something that you can't necessarily see. And so you don't always recognize where you have gaps or where you have kind of critical, what I call points of failure, where if somebody leaves the business, you're losing a huge amount of knowledge and information. In a lot of growth companies, what happens is you've got a lot of different handoffs that are happening across your business, and you could be losing with each handoff anywhere between 20% and 70% of the knowledge can be lost at each handoff. So if you think about that over time, if you've got 10 handoffs, it's like a really horrific game of telephone, right? Where you get to the end and what you're getting out doesn't resemble what you put in. And part of that is that, the skill knowledge transfer isn't often recognized as a skill. But when you're doing knowledge transfer with adult learners in particular, you need three things. People need to understand what they're doing. They need to understand why it's important that they're doing that thing. That creates the stickiness. And they need to know the how of that thing. So how it's getting done, how it's going to help them, et cetera, et cetera. If any one of those three things is missing in that communication or that knowledge transfer, it's going to create a gap and it's going to create that information loss. And so one of the other things that I try and help organizations with is how do you create mechanisms for capturing mission critical information within your organization so that if somebody wins the lottery and leaves and doesn't come back to work the next day, you haven't lost that. But also, how do you do it just from the perspective of making it easier for people to get their jobs done so that they're not having to have countless meetings to clarify or gather information, but that you have mechanisms built in for them to do that. The other benefit beyond just getting the work done is that's how people grow. So if you have managers or you have people within your organization, I shouldn't just say managers. I kind of separate between managers and leaders. Managers, that's a functional kind of job. Leaders can be anyone. But if you have people in your organization who are sharing information and sharing knowledge and doing that really effectively, that creates this really kind of powerful differentiator for your company because you have so many people who are not only knowledge holders in their own right, but who can create capabilities through that knowledge in other people. So it's a huge differentiator when companies can do that well.
And what does that look like as far as, I think of documenting, how to perform a job. What are some examples of what that looks like when it's done well? What are the references?
Yeah, so I think the first point is simple, easy to use documentation that's present and visible where your employees are doing the work, whether that's references up on the wall in a in-office environment, whether that's things like desktop backgrounds, whether that's things like knowledge centers. So things like some of the virtual collaboration tools have places where you can share and hold and store documentation around your processes. And I'm not talking about the 200-page book that nobody reads. I'm talking about, for each step in your process, do you have a one-page summary document that tells people how to do that, everything they need to know about that particular step or function or process or policy, whatever it is. So it starts with documentation. From there, it is, do you have programs in place for formally training people around those things? So do you have a formal training program that doesn't just dump the book on people and expect them to read it? We all learn in different ways. So we have to make sure that we have mechanisms in our formal training that combine visual cues for people who are visual learners, that have written cues for people who like to read, and that's how they consume information, and auditory and verbal cues for people who consume information through their kind of hearing, right? So that's the formal training component. And same thing, it has the what, the why, and the how built into it so that people know what they're doing at each step. But then it doesn't stop there. It's also ongoing coaching and training. So one of the things that we haven't talked about, Meredith, one of the things I also do is management development training, which is really around the coaching aspect of knowledge transfer and performance. So how do you give feedback in a supportive, constructive way? How do you make it so it's safe to receive that feedback? So psychologically safe to receive that feedback so that you can calibrate the performance over time, because as people learn and grow, what they need to learn kind of changes. So initially they need more formal instruction, more direction. As they start to grow and develop that skill, they need more opportunities to practice it. So it's the manager's responsibility to find them those opportunities to practice those skills or that knowledge or apply that knowledge. And then from there, then it may become, okay, how do you advance it and start to peel back the layers a little bit for them? And that's where you start to say, okay, how can we teach them to teach it? Because when you teach, you learn also. So you kind of have to understand following any formal training, what are the ways that you progress people through that transition of knowledge so that the knowledge doesn't atrophy, it actually grows and builds on itself over time?
Oh, such a good point. Angela, we could talk another hour. I know it's been so fascinating. I can tell we're just really getting started. However, given the time constraints of my podcast, we'll need to wrap up. I just love everything you've shared. You have so broad and deep experience in this area, and I love your passion and enthusiasm. It's just a great combination. So please share how people can connect with you and how they can learn more about your work at Grow You, so that if they want to engage with you, they can do that.
Yeah. So you can find me on LinkedIn. So Angela-S-Priest is my handle on LinkedIn. Or you can find me on my website, www.growu.com, and that's spelled GROYU.
That's great. Angela, thank you so much. I love the work you're doing in the world, the way you're having such a transformative impact with the clients who are lucky enough to work with you. I admire all that you're doing and the rapid transformations that you're helping to bring about. I just think it's great. So thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Meredith, for everything you're doing to get the word out to people. I love it. And thank you for having me on. This has been awesome.
It has been great. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out our 2 books, Connect with Your Team and Peer Coaching Made Simple. While you're there, download the free Facilitator Guide to find out how to implement our unique peer coaching system. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.